Hello, everybody. Welcome to this evening's event, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Sam, and I'm an academic researcher based at the University of Cambridge. I'm also one of the co-conveners of the Social Power and Mental Health Conference. The conference has been produced in collaboration with several local organisations, including CPFT NHS Trust, Lifecraft and QTI Coalition of Colour. But all of the thinking, planning and creating has been done by our Social Power and Mental Health Steering Group. And the steering group is made up of a group of local researchers, campaigners and activists who have first-hand experience of mental health challenges and the psychiatric system, or both. Each session of the conference has been and will continue to be chaired by a member of the steering group. And for today's keynote talk, I'm delighted to welcome Camille Riviere, who is going to be our chair. So over to you, Camille.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Camille Riviere, and I'm a mature PhD student researcher in Department of Psychiatry at the University of Cambridge. I also have lived experience with ADHD and depression. Now it's time to introduce tonight's speaker. Before that, I have to give a brief content warning for today's session. There will be references to mental illness and mental distress throughout, and there may also be references to other potentially distressing issues. For people who are joining from the UK, a list of organizations that can offer support if you become distressed can be found at bbc.co.uk/actionline. Our speaker this evening is Professor Imogen Tyler, who is head of the sociology department at Lancaster University. For many of us in the audience, Imogen's work will need little introduction. Across a range of books, journal articles, and public interventions, Imogen has developed path-breaking approaches to the study of social inequalities, with a particular focus on stigma, migration, gender, class, and power in the UK today. What marks out Imogen's work is her commitment to speaking truth to power on many of the key issues of our times, on the refugee crisis, immigration detention, the politics of austerity, protest and citizenship, racism, mental health, and many other topics. It is because of this focus on public issues and this commitment to public scholarship that we are so excited to have Imogen contributing to the Social Power and Mental Health Conference tonight. In her talk this evening, Imogen will be drawing on some of her recent work, in particular her book on stigma, power, the machinery of inequality, published in 2020. By Zed Books, which is a must-read for anyone interested in social power and mental health. The book shines a light on the role stigma plays in our everyday lives, highlighting its embeddedness in the social relations of capitalism and its role in reproducing inequality and injustice. Today, Imogen will be reflecting specifically on the relationship between what she terms stigma, power, and mental health. I'd like to hand over now to Imogen, who will begin her talk with a brief visual description. Remember, post your comments and questions into our Padlet. We're sharing the link in the chat now. Off to you, Imogen.
Thank you for such a lovely, kind introduction. So I am a middle-aged white woman with short hair and glasses and red lipstick. And I've got a Northern English accent. So that's for those of you who can now hopefully picture me speaking. So I just need to sort out my screen view a second, because my screen's full of the presentation. So I've got somebody, Nikki, who's very kindly going to move the slides while I speak. So thanks so much for inviting me to give this talk. I've been dropping into sessions as much as I can over the past few days. And I really appreciate the way this conference is bringing together lived experiences of mental distress and academic research and bringing those into conversation and dialogue. When Sam Strong first got in touch with me, probably almost 2 years ago now, to invite me to give this lecture, I don't think any of us could have anticipated quite how timely a conference on social power and mental health would be. We've lived through a year of illness, grief, radical uncertainty for so many, a year of endemic mental distress, and a year also when so many of us have been awed by the social power of mutual aid within our local communities. However, Britain was in a state of acute social crisis before the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is kind of where I want to begin, with the decade of austerity cuts to the UK welfare state. And I will mainly focus on the UK in this talk, but I think what I'm talking about, many of you elsewhere in the world will relate to these themes too. These are global shifts. But in the UK, we've had a decade of cuts to state welfare, which left the most disadvantaged members of our society actually dangerously exposed to a pandemic like the one we're currently experiencing. And as death rates in the UK and illness rates in the UK have revealed how exposed we were. And I think I want to get across why we've been so exposed. One of the reasons is that although this is one of the richest nations in the world, 1/5 of the population live in poverty in the UK. That's 14.7 million people and rising. In 2020, an estimated 2 million people in the UK experienced destitution. Destitution is defined as an income so low that a household is regularly unable to meet their basic needs. And these are needs defined by the charity Joseph Rowntree as having a home or food, heating, lighting, clothing, shoes, or basic toiletries. Social scientists estimate that the number of people in destitution in the UK is going to double, and this is partly a consequence of the pandemic and actually partly of Brexit, to 3.6 million in 2022. So that'll be 3.6 million people next year who are regularly unable to access the things they need to sustain their lives in any kind of comfortable way. There are also significant geographic differences in the distribution of poverty and destitution in the UK. So in Northwest England, where I live and I'm speaking from tonight, where I was born, grew up and still work, an estimated actually 4 to 6% of the population are experiencing destitution as I speak to you. What's this look like? Well, we can think about hunger. It's estimated that 10% of the British population is food insecure. That means they experience hunger or they have an inability to secure enough food of sufficient quality or quantity to enable good health. And this hunger, defined in these terms, means you can't fully participate in society because of this, or that you might regularly cut down on food or skip meals because you haven't got enough money. Food banks and other mass forms of charitable emergency food provision were almost unknown in Britain between 1950 and 2010. Now every city and town has a food bank, and some have several. So everywhere we see, every supermarket now, it's ordinary to see an emergency food donation point near the checkout. That is a very recent phenomena. Emergency food programs have escalated over the past year during the pandemic. The Trussell Trust, one of the major food bank providers, has shown a 61% increase in food parcels across the UK network. 6 parcels of emergency food aid a minute. My local food bank has recorded a 400% increase in need during the pandemic. Sorry, Nikki, next slide. Prior to the pandemic, life expectancy was beginning to fall in the UK for the first time since official records began. So this was already happening. In 2018, for example, the lifespan of deprived women in Britain fell for the first time since the 1920s. And the gap between the poorest and most advantaged women reached a record high since records of mortality were kept of around 7 years and 5 months difference between in mortality rate between those groups. And of course, excess mortality or premature death has increased dramatically since the pandemic, with 150,000 people recorded to have died of COVID-19 in the past 12 months, but with much higher death rates, very dramatically concentrated in poorer regions and areas and in ethnic minority communities. So all the scientific evidence suggests that this disappearance, austerity, this disappearance of the post-war welfare state, combined now with the effects of a pandemic and an economic recession, which we know is going to deepen over the next period. All of these things combined are foreshortening lives, the lives of working class people, the lives of elderly, disabled people, basically those without the necessary accumulated reserves of wealth and social capital to help themselves or their loved ones, as these social safety nets are cut away and ever greater numbers of people fall through gaps in state and charitable provisions. Next slide. Alongside poverty, destitution, premature death, not happy topics, but we've also seen this gap between the rich and poor expand even further. So over the past 12 months during the pandemic, there's been a significant increase in accumulation of wealth at the very top of society. So people are profiting effectively from the crisis that we're currently living through, as they have been all through the last decade. So there's a growing unevenness in the distribution of wealth, health and opportunity in the UK. So why am I starting here? Because I think what I want to contribute to your conference is that when we're talking about mental health and mental distress, we need to begin with this issue of the uneven distribution of mental distress. And we need to think about issues such as poverty and inequality. It isn't possible to be destitute and mentally well, for example. Mental distress is experienced in and structured by social and economic context. And having access to the resources required to be well is central to any conversation that we have. So I'm going to dig a bit deeper now into this kind of entangled relationship between stigma, poverty, mental health, and neoliberal capitalism. And I want to think about the ways in which we might sharpen the conceptual teeth of stigma, a concept that's already come up a lot of times in our conversations at this conference, and how kind of sharpening the teeth of stigma might assist us in understanding how society makes us sick, and also what then, understanding that better, what we might do about it. And this talk draws on my book, Stigma, the Machinery of Inequality, and on my work as an activist with local and national organisations around poverty and welfare, and also on personal experiences, past and present. And I want to begin where my book begins and opens, with a story about my friend that I'm going to call Stephanie, who's given her permission for me to reshare this story with you tonight. But to tell you, this is a distressing story, and I'm going to read for a little bit that's in the book. It is a distressing story which does talk about self-harm and suicidal feelings. Next slide. March 2019. So I'm sitting with my friend Stephanie in the corner of a bar in Lancaster, which is the small city in northwest England where I live and work. Stephanie is a former school teacher and a single mum whom I've got to know through our work together on the Morecambe Bay Poverty Truth Commission, one of 13 commissions that was then running in the UK, which bring together people living in poverty with local decision makers to try and find ways to ameliorate the destitution which has followed in the wake of austerity. When I told Stephanie that I was writing a book about stigma, she asked if she could tell me her stigma story so I could share it with others. And she wanted to meet me in a public place in this bar because her wounds are raw and she feels like a public setting would allow her to retain some composure and dignity while she speaks. So here we are, two middle-aged women drinking coffee in a city centre bar. Late afternoon sunlight streams in from the window behind the table where we sit, casting shadows over Stephanie's face as she explains how she reached a point where she began carving stigma words into her arms, stomach, thighs with a razor blade. The only way I can describe it, she says, is if you watch a washing machine go through its cycle. You have worries and then they calm down. More worries, then they calm down. Then the machine goes into spin cycle and you get to that point when it feels like it's not going to stop. And the only way to get out is to attack yourself because there's nobody else left. You have to cut that spin cycle. It's as harsh as pulling the plug. That's what you're doing, but it only works for a little while, for seconds. Then you feel even more shame for having done it. The story that Stephanie tells me this day began over a decade ago. So it's a story that could have happened to anybody. Her mum was diagnosed with cancer, terminal cancer. Her husband told her he was leaving her. She and her daughter moved into her mum's house so she could care for her mum. After her mum died, she got a temporary job as a teaching assistant. So she'd been a teacher, but she'd had to give that up while she did the care work, and then she went back into school, but this time she could only go back in as a teaching assistant, but she started to build a better life. Not long afterwards, she had an accident at work, and that accident left her immobilised and in chronic pain. And that started a kind of cycle of medical interventions, operations. She finally had a knee replacement. When she got back on her feet, she secured a new teaching post. Finally, she was back on her feet. But then her daughter, Isla, became seriously ill and she had to take time off work to care for her. And her employer lost patience with the periods of parental leave and she was forced to quit her job. So this is a very familiar story about women's unpaid labour, about the care they provide for elderly relatives and children, and how this care work can make it difficult, sometimes impossible, to sustain a waged work. During these years of difficult, if ordinary life events, Stephanie had to sell her home to prevent repossession. And cuts to school budget meant that, because of austerity, meant that supply work that she used to get by on had dried up. And before long, she sold everything of value that she owned. As she says in this quote on the slide, the shame is building throughout these years. Every time the card was declined, when I went shopping, I'd be standing there with £6 of shopping, but it wouldn't go through. And everybody in the queue is, you know, every little thing that happens piles on more stigma and shame. So Stephanie's really struggling to keep a roof over her head. She's relying on food banks to survive. Then in desperation, she takes out a high interest payday loan and a rapid spiral into debt follows. Before long, she says, we started getting letters to evict us from our rented accommodation. So the exact period when all of this sort of spiral is happening, sort of to Stephanie, all of this is happening exactly the point where the British government's austerity programme of welfare reform is beginning. So in February, next slide, 2008, in the midst of the global banking crisis, then Shadow Chancellor George Osborne gave a speech with the title, "There is a dependency culture," to the Conservative Party. He used this speech as an opportunity to outline the party's economic response to the financial crisis. a response which centred on plans to implement what he described as the most far-reaching programme of welfare reform for a generation. There was no evidence for the claims that he made in this speech that an overly generous system of welfare provisions was responsible for a negative national economic outlook. But this is the argument that he made. He described the economy as indebted, stagnant, inflexible, vulnerable, and exposed. He identified what he described as millions of people languishing on out-of-work benefits as the central problem or challenge facing the British economy. He described these people as unproductive, an unproductive residuum, persistently playing the system, deceitfully milking the rewards of something he termed as what he termed a something for nothing culture. He announced cuts in benefits, services and provisions, a deterrent welfare system with conditions and sanctions and punitive workfare programmes outsourced to private and voluntary sectors. This, he said, is the tough medicine required to move people off benefits and into work. He promised these reforms would end what he described as a shameful dependency culture in Britain, free up supply of capital and labour, unleashing billions of pounds and restoring the health of public finances, liberating those he described as stuck on benefits and transforming, he promised, the life chances of millions of families. In fact, what followed in the wake of austerity is what can only be described as a planned social catastrophe. When the Conservative Party came to power and the coalition government in 2010, this programme of welfare reform began in earnest. And we see this in the ways in which things like benefits systems are delivered fairly quickly. So this is from some work from Mary O'Hara talking about job centre advisors. And a job centre advisor she interviewed, and others have been interviewed since, who described how their jobs changed almost overnight from one of helping people to what they this person called the persecution of vulnerable people. The pressure was incredible, she says, as frontline staff became subject to constant and aggressive pressure to meet and exceed targets, to get people off benefits by imposing sanctions and conditions. It was, she says, like getting brownie points for cruelty. And when what Stephanie experienced when she applied for benefits was a welfare system in chaos, as it was being redesigned in ways that sought to deter people from making claims. The stigma Stephanie encountered that she described to me when interacting with frontline workers and welfare agencies was shocking. However, this was only one element of what she described as an overwhelmingly hostile environment. For what accompanied the implementation of these welfare reforms was also the most extraordinary political and media propaganda campaign, which sought to manufacture consent for austerity by stigmatising those in receipt of relief. Stories about benefits cheats were suddenly everywhere. They seeped incessantly into Stephanie's world. She said that every time she turned on the radio in the car or turned on the television at night or brushed past a rack of newspapers in a shop, she would come across things like, "These people are stealing your taxes," which left her thinking, that's me they're talking about. This welfare stigma machine needled Stephanie from every direction. She said, it keeps coming, it's relentless, one constant cycle of judgment, like a knife being stuck repeatedly into you. This unremitting stigma slowly eroded Stephanie's self-esteem. She began to feel that her daughter would be better off without her. She started to regularly self-harm. She became suicidal, and she said, I stockpiled tablets, waiting for the right moment. In 2015, a letter arrived alleging that she'd erroneously claimed income in the form of a child tax credit to which she wasn't entitled, and that this benefit was being stopped while an investigation took place. This regular stream of income, about £200 a month, was essential to service the interest on her debt. When she read this letter, she broke down. I was in a state, she said, I completely lost it. I was absolutely distraught. I was hitting myself with things. I was scraping my skin off. That same day, she was supposed to attend an appointment at the job centre. So she rang and explained to them that she was in terrible distress, but they told her that a failure to attend would be taken as evidence that she was unwilling to work and that she would be sanctioned, potentially losing her rights to claim any benefits for up to 3 years. So she said, I just got in the car and I parked illegally in the street outside the job centre. I was hysterical, I was bleeding. The security guard looked at me and said I couldn't go inside. Eventually, the job coach didn't speak to, the job coach came out of the building with the form. He didn't speak to her, he just handed her a pen and she signed on in the street. As I signed, she said, blood dripped all over the paper. I will never forget it. Nobody expressed concern or worry for her as she stood outside the job centre, blood dripping from her wrists and arms. Nobody attempted to soothe her or calm her. Nobody called for medical assistance. When I asked her why nobody did any of those things, she said nobody cared. She said, you end up not feeling human, like you don't have the right to be part of that society. In the end, you're so dehumanized, you begin to perceive yourself as an object, a thing, a cockroach, just scum. When Stephanie is describing this to me, her voice in the cafe over coffee, her voice is breaking and her body is shaking. And I stop and say, I'm really worried that recalling this trauma is repeating the harm. And she said at one point, a psychotherapist said to me that sometimes it helps to write down negative thoughts rather than keep them in your head. So what I ended up doing was writing a list of descriptors of myself, and she recalls them: waste of space, failure, freak, useless, burden, scrounger, weight of oxygen, a whole list of negative things. Then one day, she said, I started to cook the words from the list into my body. I'd think to myself, I'll do this one this time. I was writing on myself to say to the rest of the world, who you perceive as looking at you like that, I know, you don't have to tell me. I already know, I know what you're thinking, but don't think I don't know that as well. Look. When I arrived home, after my conversation with Stephanie, I lay down on my bed and I wept for a long time. Next slide. So I'm going to return to Stephanie's story in a moment at the end of the paper. But now I'm going to go into a very different register. I'm going to go into a register of how mainstream, if you like, anti-stigma campaigns imagine stigma. So what I hope I've done through Stephanie's story, and with her kind permission to share her story, is tried to show how stigma is a kind of form of power that's being produced from lots of different social, cultural, media places, and how that starts to inscribe itself or affect the way people feel or think about themselves and others. I'm going to return to that understanding of stigma that's coming out of, partly out of my conversations with Stephanie and many other people in my work on welfare and poverty. But this is quite different, I think, than the more sanitized understanding of stigma, or perhaps an understanding of stigma without power that I think we get in mainstream anti-stigma campaigns. So I don't want to be too negative about some of these campaigns, because I think they can do positive, as I'll say. but I think that they lack the teeth that we need to understand where stigma comes from, who's producing it, why. So in the middle of all of this austerity program, in the middle of all of this incredible distress being caused by austerity as well, that I've just illustrated, in 2016, 3 members of the British royal family, Prince William and his wife, Catherine, and Prince Harry, launched Heads Together, a new campaign to, quote, end the stigma around mental health. This was an umbrella organisation originally for 8 existing UK-based mental health charities. And the idea was to bring them together under one organisational brand. It sought to harness the significant media power of these popular younger members of the royal family. The publicity for this campaign stated that while there's been progress in recent decades, stigma remains a key issue in preventing people with mental health challenges and accessing the help and support they need. As Prince William put it, people can't and won't seek help because they're ashamed about what people might think. To this end, it focused on eradicating stigma as a barrier to help seeking through initiatives that centre on promoting disclosure, individual disclosures of mental distress. As they describe it, shattering stigma begins with simple conversations. When you realise that mental health problems affect your friends, neighbours, children and spouses, the walls of judgment and prejudice around these issues will begin to fall. Next slide. So the basic idea is destigmatisation through disclosure to remove barriers to help seeking. And to facilitate these conversations, an array of communications technologies were put to work, developing a website, social media platforms, hashtags like OK to say, under which people could share their own experiences. There was also lots of short films featuring celebrities and public figures in conversation and talking about their own mental health challenges, such as this one between Lady Gaga and Prince William over Skype. And there were other films with ordinary members of the public, such as ambulance drivers talking about experiences of mental distress in the aftermath of stressful events at work. The idea was through this accumulation and dissemination of individual conversations that you can change the national conversation on mental health. There's much to be admired about the values and ambitions of Heads Together, including the candour of these princes about their own struggles with mental distress following the death of their mother. And the existing evidence supports the claims made that negative attitudes around mental health problems are not only damaging and discriminatory, but exacerbate mental distress. Apologies for my dog barking. Prince William states that it's time to feel normal about mental health. But as Will Davis argues, the idea that one is simply unwell might provide comfort to people wrestling with their own depression or anxiety, but it veils over potentially a whole host of more fundamental cultural, political and economic questions regarding the distribution of distress in our society. MAD activists, Canadian scholar activists affiliated with MAD studies in particular, have also sought to trouble the appropriation of personal experiences of psychiatric distress in these big mental health charitable organisations and other organisations. They're apprehensive, rightly I think, about the commodification of personal stories in what they describe as well-being marketplaces that are increasingly dominated by powerful corporate actors. They argue, and think of Lucy Costa's work in particular, and there's a reference on the slide, that this marketplace in well-being is actually often aligned with the interests of organisations rather than mad people themselves, and does little to address broader issues such as poverty. Okay, next slide. In January 2017, that this Heads Together campaign was lent political support when the British Prime Minister, apologies, Theresa May, made a specific commitment to address shortfalls in mental health services. So what we get is a kind of, you know, literally the royal family and now the Prime Minister at the time coming out to support this idea. And it felt, you know, she stood on the streets of Downing Street and said, you know, she's going to make a specific commitment to address what she described as the burning injustice of mental illness, a failure to prioritise mental health services and the lack of parity between mental health services and physical health. But of course, that failed to materialise, as we know, and cuts continued. In fact, mental health services were hit hard and early by austerity measures, and this pattern has continued. So much waiting, suffering, and premature death. So I suppose my point is that if one of the aims of Heads Together is to eradicate stigma in order that people are willing and able to access services, the timing of the campaign begs the question, what kinds and what quality of services actually exist for those in need, both now and if the current programmes of austerity cuts continue in the future. This isn't to say that talking about mental distress with friends and family can lessen social stigma, but rather that anti-stigma initiatives which want to remove barriers to help seeking that don't simultaneously address either the erosion of public service provision or the deeper social causes of increased levels of mental distress will likely be very limited in their impact. If we unpack this further, next slide, we can think about how neoliberalism itself as a political economy makes us sick. Next slide, please. How politics makes us sick, neoliberal epidemics. Ted Schrecker and Claire Bamber detail how neoliberal economic policies in themselves create huge amounts of chronic stress across large parts of the populations in many countries, through reductions in things like workplace rights, job security, pay levels, welfare. So this chronic stress is a sort of is a condition of the economy and the ways in which the economy is run. And this governmental production of chronic stress is unequally distributed, and it gets under the skin, as they evidence in this book, through multiple and well understood psychosocial mechanisms. And Stephanie's story illustrates that so well. As state benefit systems change, but also wider social and public attitudes to welfare claimants become changes. So it's not only that austerity-driven reforms have intensified a broader epidemic of chronic stress, but as detailed, the cuts to social provisions are enacted and legitimated through state sanctions and sometimes state-led welfare stigma production. So it's these different arms of the state that we see working together. And I'm going to be quite quick on this next bit, but I can always answer questions about it. But also what we see if we look at behind the architecture of Heads Together, just to take that as one example, is also how corporations are playing a part in this entire process. So Heads Together is, and there's 8 charitable partners, corporate partners, who are major 4 corporate partners who are raising funds that are bankrolling the charities that Heads Together is supporting. And these 4 corporate partners, and we can do this in very clear ways, looking at who these corporations are some of them are direct beneficiaries of neoliberal economic policies and austerity reforms. So some of the very corporations that are eroding, or in partnership with government, are eroding state welfare and social care, including access to mental health services, are now funding an anti-stigma programme. So Virgin would be a good example. Virgin Money is a bank which was set up or grew massively through the financial crisis, which saw the government have to take over a bank called Northern Rock, which collapsed, which the British government later sold to Virgin Money at a cut price. And you can follow that story easy online if you want to look it up. And then Virgin set up a company in 2010 called Virgin Care, with which it sought to expand its interest into the private UK health services market. And Virgin Care, this is a huge market of privatisation of public health in Britain. And Virgin Care is, at the moment, I've got contracts of around £2 billion in taxpayer-funded care services, and there's lots of things you can read about these services and their quality online. Okay. Sorry, next slide. The point by picking on Virgin there, by following this story, is really just to tell you a story about how corporations are not passive actors, but they're kind of key actors. And we get these sort of central contradictions, or they appear to be contradictions, where they're funding the charitable end of mental health support, or championing it as part of their brand, their public brand, but at the same time they're actually profiting from the process that's increasing chronic mental distress across society. Next slide. Nearly finished. So it's in this context, this paradox, that the very systems and arms of government, political, corporate and media, that are producing stigma and profiting from it, are also bankrolling anti-stigma mental health campaigns. And the problem for me is that understanding the stigma, which are decoupled from this type of analysis. We need to couple stigma to questions of power, history, economics, politics, in order to get a concept that's actually got some teeth. Austerity in the UK for me is an object lesson in the production and harnessing of stigma for political and economic purpose. The stigma politics of austerity has made many people unwell, exposed us very badly to this pandemic. Welfare stigma, as Stephanie's story shows, also changed how people relate to each other. It eroded structures of care, but also corroded compassion. Stephanie's story, which I open with, highlights the way in which welfare stigma comes to saturate and permeate everyday encounters. Stephanie recounted to me a decade of stigmatizing encounters with corporate agencies, banks and debt companies, and agents of the state, job centre officials, private sector medical professionals, PIP assessments, you name it. This constant process of feeling judged and stigmatized, needled with stigma at every turn. It was felt to her inescapable, seeping incessantly into her world. And she described how she came to anticipate stigma, how she was enclosed by it. She says you only have to watch any programme, the evidence is there that you're kind or hated. These people are stealing your taxes and you're thinking that is me that they're talking about. Trapped in a cycle. It keeps coming, it keeps coming. China Mills's work has been very important for showing how, paying attention to what she describes as the psychic life of austerity, and how austerity is lived and felt as an effective force and an atmospheric fear that pervades the body, that wears people out. And this kind of psychosocial understanding, I think, is key for my own understanding of the kind of cumulative effects of stigma as lived experience and its relationship with lived experience with the governmental exercise of stigma as a form of power. And it's those two things together, lived experiences of stigma and its cumulative effects and its corroding of mental and physical health, and the governmental exercise of stigma and the relationship between them. So in my own work, what I kind of always realize we have to do when we're thinking about stigma is two main things. One is look up to where stigma is being designed and crafted and activated. Who's producing stigma? How is it being crafted and activated to govern populations on multiple scales through state-led stigma campaigns and cultural stigma production that cascades into our everyday interactions with each other? The other thing is looking back. So actually understanding that what appears to be new is very often something very old that's being reconfigured. Tracking power historically. So when we're thinking about stigma, we can think about histories of stigma, how poverty and welfare have always had a relationship with stigma historically, and what we see replayed. Because understanding how it's being replayed, also we can look back to histories of struggles against stigma in different periods of time. And finally, before we move to questions, staying alert to stigma power. We're about to enter in the UK and across the world, or we're in, but we're about to feel the effects of an unbelievable new economic recession on an incredible scale. And we need to be alert to where stigma is coming from as we enter this. Who's going to be scapegoated for the economic recession to come? Who's producing stigma and for what purposes? In order to defend ourselves against it, we require better understanding of how stigma is propagated as a technology of division and dehumanization. We need to track the role played by stigma politics in producing kind of toxic climates of fear and hatred. And we're seeing that so vividly across the world in the rise of authoritarian leaders and regimes, from the USA to India to Hungary. We need to examine how stigma power is crafted and cultivated by political leaders as a way of leveraging political capital. And we need to understand better also, as I've talked about this evening, how this divisive politics gets under the skin of people, of those it subjugates, how it changes the ways in which people think about themselves and others, and how that can crush hope and weaken social solidarity if we're not attentive to it. And I think all those papers might feel like it's been negative, actually understanding stigma as a form of power is positive, because once you start to think in this way about stigma, you're tooling yourself with what we need to be able to resist it, and to not let it, those divisions work, to be able to call it out better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imogen. That was an amazing talk. And regain my thinking here. Again, thanks to Imogen for a brilliant lecture. Now, before the Q&A, we want to gather some feedback from you. At the beginning, you were showed 4 questions on Padlet. After the conference, the steering group are going to be putting together a roadmap for mental health to be shared with decision makers in Cambridgeshire and nationwide. This will build on the themes discussed in the conference. So I'm now going to ask 4 questions and give you a few minutes to respond. You can also post your responses in the Zoom chat. Don't worry if you don't have thoughts straight away. We'll be sending a form to everyone after the event, so you can also fill your thoughts in there. Reflecting on Imogen's talk this evening, what are the lessons for psychiatry and mental health services? Second, survivor service user movements and activists. Third, for government. And fourth, for researchers. And I'm going to just give you a few minutes to respond. So we're going to have a few minutes of relative quiet, shall we say. Or we'll just wait to listen to the dogs. Mine, if not yours, Imogen. All right, Ed is showing us the Padlet, which is where people are posting some responses to this, and we'll slowly accumulate this. It was a really informative talk, Imogen. I feel like I now need to, I confess I haven't read your book yet, and I will be.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
There's a lot to cram in, because it's, you know, I was trying to use Stephanie's very kindly, the story she's gifted us. You know, I told her I was doing this talk tonight. I don't think she's come along, but she said she might do, so to listen. But it's trying to to show stigma as a form of power through an individual story, you know, that reconfigures us away from that more conventional understanding of stigma that has become kind of normalized in kind of social psychology. That's the kind of aim of the work. So I hope that worked. But in the book, it's not just mental health. I look at lots of different aspects of that, particular focus on racism and colonialism, and that I didn't focus on tonight, but I'd be happy to talk about as well. So in the book, racism is very much an origin point of stigma and a kind of its preeminent form in a way. But I thought it was good to talk about poverty tonight as a kind of key context, I think, for mental distress and ill health at the moment in the UK.
Yeah, and around the world as well. But, yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That really, gave a lot to think about. So thank you everyone for putting your thoughts and comments into the Padlet. Now, in the time that we have left, we're going to have a Q&A. We're going to leave the Zoom chat on and give everyone a bit of time to post their questions in there. Many of you already have. So the chat is now on. If you have a question you would like to ask Imogen, please post it now. To begin, if anyone is in the session who is dialing in or who can't access the chat for any reason, I'll give you an opportunity now to speak if you would like to ask a question. And from past experience, it sometimes takes people to chime in. Again, if for some reason you can't ask your questions in the other forms presented, due to being the fact that you're dialing in or something to that effect, please feel free to unmute yourself now and go ahead and ask your question of Imogen before we move on to the questions that have been asked in the text. Okay, I think we have Anne had a question. Anne Galpin. Do you want to maybe unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, Imogen. Thank you so much for your talk. I'd be interested to know how you see the intersection with the stigma and the sort of eugenicist drive when it's combined with the medical model approach to mental distress, which is the only that's the only model that is offered to us by the state, as it were, or, you know, whereas how could we, if we actually fully, I'm trying to get at the social, I'm wanting to ask you to talk about where the social model fits in with the very important matters that you've been talking about, because the social model of mental distress would approach it from a different way. And also, I'd really love to send solidarity to Stephanie and hope that if she listens now or at a later stage, thank you for the sharing. And yeah, solidarity?
So some of you would be able to answer this question better than me in terms of the debates in disability studies around the social model and its relationship to mental health. But I think for me, thinking about disability studies and its history as a history that's concerned with the liberation of disabled people from forms of oppressive forms of control, medical state and other. That's how I tend to think about that history. And I think we need to think about the question of mental distress and capitalism and the relationship between them, which I kind of indicated tonight. So for me, and I know, Anne, you're thinking specifically here of treatment, but I guess I'm thinking also of that broader sense in which neoliberal forms of capitalism are making people unwell, and how do we liberate all of ourselves from that? That has to be another model of society, of a radical understanding of what well-being is, a radical change to the nature of work. You know, there were experiments on this taking place, but I suppose for me it is about reconnecting away from more of a liberal model, if you like, of rights, of disability rights in specific context, to a more radical understanding of how capitalism itself and the particular form of it we're living through is the problem. So I know that's a kind of general way of talking about it, but I guess what we tend to see is versions of the co-option of the social model within, for example, an organisation or institution that doesn't really affect the more root and stem kinds of change we need to see to be well.
Thanks, Imogen. That's really helpful response. So I'm going to go through some of the questions we've had put in the chat, and I'll start off with how do you reconcile basic human emotions? For example, empathy and sympathy for people like Stephanie, who work at and for the deeply harmful and immoral EWP.
I can't see the question. I'm just going from what you've just said. So how do I reconcile sympathy for both parties? Is that the question?
Let me just try rereading it. How do you reconcile basic human emotions, e.g. empathy and sympathy for people like Stephanie, who work at and for deeply harmful and immoral DWP? I think what they're trying to ask, if I'm interpreting this correctly, is the basic human emotions of the people working at the DWP for people that they're working with, such as Stephanie. I think that's what they're trying to ask.
Okay. It's a good question, and in a way it really relates to how I met Stephanie and others through my own work with the Poverty Truth Commission. So how Poverty Truth works as a movement is by bringing people in one local area, people with power, including DWP, police, local councillors, doctors, GPs, you name it, fire service, together with people with experience. And we have to, over a period of a year to 18 months, work together as a group relationally. And that is really hard thing to do. And that process itself produces change, which is produces real change actually, but some of the change would have to be more revolutionary on a bigger scale, but it can produce real local change. But it's difficult because they're the roles. And actually there was some recent report that I put on the slides that came out of Disability News Service, of some research from Sheffield University interviewing people who'd worked for the DWP in this period that I've been describing in the talk, and what happened to some of them having to have those jobs. So how do we stop the stigma politics that is all about a kind of optics? It's an optics that makes us see each other through the lens of stigma. How do you defeat that through kind of relational forms of activism, relational forms of solidarity? It's really hard work. That is, to me, what activism is, that having to work with people who are, if you like, your natural enemy in terms of where you've been socially located. So it's not an easy task, but that is the work that will bring about change.
Forgive me, but that makes quite a lot of sense, particularly if you're thinking about when people live in more urban areas, are closer together with people that have different views, different life experiences, they're more likely to vote for their rights. And I think this plays out in the same way in what you're talking about, in that if you can get people having conversations that are sitting on both sides of these desks, if you will, it can help move us forward and force change within institutions.
Yeah.
So it's really makes sense.
Yeah.
So the next question is, how can we get politicians to understand the reality? They live in their own world and have no idea how living on benefits actually is. I feel the only way to improve is revolution, but I don't see that happening.
Well, it depends what we mean by revolution, I suppose, partly as well, because I guess local forms of activism can create revolutionary change as well. And we have to sometimes remove, perhaps there's moments, and perhaps this is one of them, where kind of Westminster politics, which tends to be what we mean by politics, is kind of, in a kind of stalemate where we can't seem to influence that. And that's not always the place where politics is happening or where we can do it. So I think for me, working locally has been a key way to keep hope going and to form relationships locally, to do local forms of activism and politics, where you can see very small change, scale things happening, and you can be with others who, you can be in solidarity with others, have friendships with people that you never imagined you would meet or talk to or learn from them, listening to others. That is what keeps me going and me from despairing about the bigger stuff that seems to be so immovable. So I guess partly for me, it's, it has to begin here where you are, has to begin with where you are, that politics, not just looking up here. And I think if you live in the north of England, you perhaps feel already decentered from Westminster politics, particularly. It feels so irrelevant and so detached from the realities of everyday life, that perhaps that adds to that sense of a kind of DIY-ness to just doing it differently where you are. So I guess that's what keeps me going, but I'm not saying don't vote and don't stand and get rid of the ones we've got and get some better ones, all of that too, but don't give that all your energy, because it's a kind of pot of doom.
Makes sense. Okay, our next question is, has the government ever acknowledged or taken ownership of the impacts of their austerity policies? It seems almost unbelievable that they can impact lives like this without using points backed by evidence.
Isn't it? So the United Nations have been and visited twice. Philip Alston leading extensive reports, and many disabled groups were involved in giving evidence to Philip Alston in his reports on the impact of austerity, which has breached lots of United Nations rules that we've signed, signatories of things we've signed up to, the rights of disabled people, etc. So, you know, it seems to be that the particular authoritarian forms of neoliberal market, free market, also nationalist governments that we have at the moment just have totally breached, if you like, some of those liberal democratic norms, which would have given us kind of normal routes or purchase, or, you know, to force a response or force a government out. So no, they just deny it, but the economic costs are significant of the amount of ill health, mental and physical ill health of these policies. So there is a sense in which it feels inevitable, and we've seen this during the pandemic, there will have to be some rollback just because of the levels of illness in the population. Everything is broken. So what emerges next is going to be where the struggle is.
Okay, our next question is technology platforms play an important role in these destigmatization campaigns. How do these relate to ideas about platform capitalism? How do these relate to ideas about platform capitalism, given the dominance of Facebook, Google, etc.?
What can we do about platform capitalism? Sorry, I just moved. Is this in the Padlet? So I can just read it.
It might be in the Padlet. I've been getting these sent to me by Ed.
Sorry.
So I've kind of copied them out. Sorry.
That's okay. I found it on the Padlet.
Sorry.
Technology platforms play an important role. Okay. Yeah. So, well, I would say that I guess I don't really think that anti-stigma campaigns are very effective. I think that, so I guess for me, the question would be more the role that these technology companies play in producing stigma that is more significant in terms of my interest in them. So I think that the social media is at the center of a kind of new era of stigma politics, which is accelerated and intensified. So I think those divisions, those sense of tribes and groups, and the divisions between them are hugely amplified by social media and how we interact with it. And are monetized and become sites of capitalist accumulation. So I think that the relationship between what I call stigma politics and technology in terms of social media is absolutely key. I don't particularly see a very progressive role for social media in terms of producing alternative politics, if I'm completely honest. Even though I participate in it myself, I think it's at the moment, certainly in terms of global politics, is much more a site of the production of division, and than it is a site for the production of social solidarities. I'm not saying we should give up on it, but I think we need to be very attentive to its negative aspects.
It's felt very polarizing, particularly in recent years, I think.
Yeah, and I think it can make us unwell. It's one of the things that can make us distressed, particularly Black and ethnic minority people and women, the misogyny, the violence. And I do write about that a little bit in the book, so you can see how I try and link misogyny historically to a kind of return of misogyny. It's very hard to be a woman in public life in this world that we currently live in without daily rape threats, death threats. And it's very hard for that, however resilient you are, however many teams of people around you you might have if you're in a position of power to protect yourself from the psychological damage and harm of that. And I do kind of talk about that in the book and how we might understand that in an historical context.
That's actually a really good transition to the next question, which is, how do you deal with motivation? This feels like a losing battle, and so many of us are pouring ourselves and our energy into trying to improve things, and those in power do not give a blank, 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 blank. Feels like we're Sisyphus. I can never say that correctly, apologies. Feels like we're Sisyphus rolling the stone up the hill, and every day I see the news and the stone is back at the bottom of the mountain.
Yeah, and I think that's part, I totally share those feelings, but look at us talking about it, I guess. I mean, we're analysing that, we're mapping that at a conference like this. That itself, to me, is very hopeful activity. We know lots of other people, and we can find them who feel like we do, have to share the same broad diagnosis of the state we're in. So we're not isolated in those feelings. Those feelings together form a consensus for something else, for something that isn't this, and for ridding those with power of that power and resisting them. And I've, in Stigma, the book, you know, I kind of use history as a resource for hope. A lot, how people, you know, have resisted in the past. So we're thinking about austerity. You know, if we look at the history of welfare in Britain, you know, all through the 18th century, people had food riots, you know, where they would just appropriate food from markets. They'd take it because they didn't have enough to eat. They would, you know, just the multiple ways in which histories of resistance. I find those very inspiring and helpful for making me feel hopeful, and kind of taking me away also from the kind of immediacy of the present and the ways in which social media kind of accelerates that feeling that everything is doom and gloom right now. There's a way in which history gives you a long view, that actually things are not so different in bad and good ways, and there are things we can learn about the future from the past. Similarly, art and fiction can be helpful for the same reasons, for taking us away from the kind of view that we're being given by mainstream media. But I do sympathise, and I do also despair at times.
I think we all do.
Especially after this year.
What's that?
Especially after this year.
Yeah, it's been a challenging year. On the other side of that, though, I must say there have been things that have come out of this year about the way we communicate and the way we come through this. I know personally I've learned quite a bit from it, and one of the things that I have appreciated is the fact that a conference like this, where we would have had this a year ago in person here in Cambridge, which is all well and good, I love that I'm seeing a much wider audience. And I've seen this on other conferences recently, where we've been able to have people participate in the conversation and be present for a conference that would never have been able to show up otherwise. So I think.
Yeah, so that there's precisely, so with every enclosure, as I would call it, of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, there's also a kind of commoning counter movement. You know, if we think about it in terms of like physics, there's this, and what you're describing is a kind of democratization of education. Now, we know that lots of corporations and universities as businesses will attempt immediately to recolonize that and enclose it and monetize it. But there's a gap being created, which is democratizing. So I agree with you that it's all the time, it's looking for those commoning movements against the kind of enclosure movements or privatisation movements that we see.
Okay, next we have, how do you let compassionate others ever understand what it's like being in austerity and despair? It does happen to anyone, as Professor Imogen stated, such a knowing presentation.
So
I'm sure I've done that justice, but.
So what's the question?
Let me try reading it one more time.
Try to read the first
part. The question is the first part, which is, how do you let compassionate others ever understand what it's like being in austerity and despair?
Yeah. So I suppose, you know, to refer back to, you know, my own story and my relationship with Stephanie and how I met her through Poverty Truth Commission, and the friendships I've made locally, and also now I'm a trustee on the National Poverty Truth Commission, and I've made friends there, people with experience and people with power coming together. It's I can only describe it them as spaces of love, which sounds a bit soppy in academia, and but actually that's what they are, in the kind of Martin Luther King sense of radical love and solidarity, and that I've learned how to be transformed by other people and by listening to them. So I feel that, you know, and I dedicated Stigma to those people I've worked with over the last few years, but they've transformed my life and how lucky I am. So in this strange way, you're meeting people in the most desperate of circumstances who've lived through the most traumatic or are living through the most traumatic experiences, but you're also learning about yourself and being in relationship to them. And that then becomes, it spreads itself. So here in Lancaster, one of the most amazing things is how we have people from the city council who are involved in that movement, who were transformed and then went back and started to transform the ways in which they delivered their frontline services. And people with experience going in and doing retraining, and the just the small tiny ripples, and all the time the big engines clawing it back, but those tiny ripples of change into how people interact. It's been tremendous to be part of that. So that's how I remain hopeful. I don't know if that helps, but that's how I've survived.
I did need to pass along, as Ed requested, that just so you know, all of the questions are being copied into the chat by Ed. So I'm reading them off in the order he's providing them to me, but
Okay.
they are also in the chat if you have a scroll. So we're now to question Q7. Really moving talk, Imogen, thank you. Is it possible to have access to these slides to read some more?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And I assume we'll provide a link or something at the end where we can provide that to them. However you want to do that, but we'll come back to that. So the next question, are the left in England aware of what is happening in Scotland? Does the left understand the potential of a breakup of the British state and a new settlement that in many ways could be radical as the historic settlement in 1945? The word scrounger was popularized by Ian Sprout, Tory MP for Aberdeenshire in 1982, and was instrumental in it becoming part of the dominant British discourse, which has become a form of symbolic and actual violence. Can we create unity for the breakup of the British state?
Well, this is a very loaded political question. I don't want to get totally into debates about new nationalism, new nations forming, breaking up, etc. Not that I don't have some sympathy as someone who lives fairly close to the Scottish border I very often wish that border could just come a little bit lower past Carlisle. It's only another half an hour really till you're at Lancaster. I'm sure the border's been down here before in the past. And I know a lot of people in the north of England feel similarly around breaking away, around regionalism, and the sorts of local politics I've been talking about also speak to that desire to, or the irrelevance of the kind of Westminster model, or the violence of it as being something. So perhaps the question for how I'd frame it is more about the danger of nationalism itself. I think we need to be wary of all nationalisms, however appealing they may be as an alternative to the version of English nationalism that is running the British state. I think I'd still want to be cautious about any other type of nationalism too. And Scotland, I love it and I spend all my holidays there, but it's not, and I've got a lot of Scottish ancestry, it turns out, from my family tree. But, you know, it isn't a nirvana either. It has its own histories and problems too. But I don't know if the left in England are aware. I can say I have a decent awareness of what's happening in Scotland myself. Don't know if that's a right answer.
No. I think that was I think that's a tough question to address. Yeah, without going down a whole nother conversation. So the last question, and then we're somewhat out of time, but where you were talking about funding and the neoliberal cycle, with private investments, etc. Do you think this is an inescapable cycle? What can we do to raise these issues to the surface and move away from hypocritical investment and funding?
This is the model of capitalism that we are living through, the version of it, this which I'm calling neoliberal, but we could call it neo-colonial just as easily, but is totally feels inescapable, but it's killing the planet. It's exhausting people and it's exhausting natural resources and the planet. It cannot continue. So it feels inescapable, but we also kind of all know, I think, the truth that it can't continue. So it feels like we are reaching some kind of end point or end game, and perhaps the pandemic has both exposed and is also accelerating that what happens next has to be different. Now, and I was at a different talk last night by Sylvia Veradici in my own department in Lancaster, which you can watch online as well. And she was talking about, you know, how the World Bank is positioning itself for a post-pandemic world, and what the version of a kind of new social contract or a new version of capitalism it will want inevitably wouldn't be the one, I think, that we might want if we want something that's where we see a much fairer distribution of wealth and resource, both within countries like Britain and globally. So I think that there's a kind of battleground lines being drawn around what the future will be, but it can't be what it is now. And I think that's what I think the consensus is going to be on both sides, or whatever place you're from, that this is not working and that it's broken for the planet and the people in it, and what comes next has to be different. And his hypocrisy is kind of so exposed. It's sort of, you know, you can't turn on the news any day, and today, you know, the contracts around COVID and the profiteering from the pandemic by politicians and corporations, it's there, it's fully exposed, it's fully visible, it's everywhere. We know that is all broken effectively. It's a kind of end game. So what comes next has to be different.
it's a really, really nice way to finish it, if I'm honest, because I think you're absolutely right. So we are out of time, and this has been an amazing conversation. I appreciate you answering all the questions and your great talk. I have been asked to pass along, if it's possible for you to answer some of the questions in the Padlet after the fact, that would be lovely. And thank you so much. Get down to thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. And thanks to Professor Imogen Tyler, our keynote speaker. We have events running for the rest of the week, which you can find out on our website. Simply Google social power and mental health, and we hope to see you at one soon. Thank you.